bars and...
Hello, we're going to have a quick look at some different putties that you can get for filling in seams in Gunpla. It's pretty much a vital thing if you plan to paint. You need to fill in the seam lines along parts, and everyone's going to need some putty, and there's so many options on the market. I thought it was a good idea to offer some suggestions on what would be good for people just starting out. So the first one we're going to look at is Vallejo's plastic putty. Now this is a very it's a very strange putty compared to most on the market. With this, it's almost like a thick paint where they've mixed the sort of a white paint with marble dust, which then dries up the same way paint does, which will fill in a seam. And this is pretty good to use because it comes straight from the tube, and you can just push it along the line like that, and you basically have the gap filled in. And to flatten it down, you can just use a wet finger and wipe it down, and you'll have an almost flat surface top. The issue with this is that it can sometimes shrink, so you would have to wipe it down, wait for it to dry, which can take sort of 10 minutes, which is extremely fast, then put on another coat afterwards. I've recently started moving away from this because while it does the job, I'm never quite happy with how it's turning out. If you have a larger gap to fill, this is no good because the way it shrinks, it doesn't support itself. So if you have too large a gap, you can't fill it with plastic putty. It just doesn't work that way. When it dries, it's not really rock solid like a porcelain finish, but it's solid enough where you can sand it and cut it back, which is vital for these kind of things. But it's not as firm as it could be. So that's Vallejo's plastic putty. You can find it pretty much anywhere, and it's usable in some cases, but you need to be using it on those cases almost exclusively. For if you're using sort of a plastic glue to join parts together and there's little tiny areas where it hasn't quite sealed properly, this is good for filling in those small gaps. It takes a couple of minutes to dry, you're done, you're moving on with the rest of the project. So that's where I would use Vallejo's plastic putty. But as a general purpose putty, I would not recommend this as a place to start. So next up we have Squadron putties. Squadron Products White Putty. This is also just known as Squadron Putty. They do a green version which is slightly different, but this is the one I've been using lately. I quite like this because it's pre-made in the tube. So you just squeeze it and out it comes. It has a slightly sandy texture when it first comes out, and it's easy to apply that way. When using this, I tend to use sculpting tools to apply it. I can find one quickly. I had one here. Here we go. Something like this, which is a wax carving tool. And you see there's a flat surface there, round one there, and then a spiked surface here. You can get hundreds of different types of these, but this is what I use to spread it around, which is just spread it down into the gap, and it's pretty easy to work with. It's very slightly tacky, but it's not horrendously so. You can work okay with it. And one advantage to using putties like this is what you often see in the Japanese sphere of Gunpla making, where they apply like this, where you can see this is clearly way over the top and over applied. Then they sand it down afterwards, which is one of the perks of using these putties. They sand very easily, and I'll give you a pretty good finish when you sand them down. Recently I've been using this just as an experiment, and because I can't be bothered to mix up the next option, but I'm happy with the results I've got from this. The issue comes from the fact that it includes a solvent, whereas this is a paint base of an acrylic paint. This uses a solvent as the liquid agent, which then dries, and that means it has vapor issues, sort of like the same vapors as nail varnish and some kinds of paint, sort of enamel paints. This has those same issues, and when you read the back of the warnings, can be harmful to breathe, vapors, can damage your liver, kidneys and brain damage, and causes birth defects. And what it's trying to say is, if you breathe too many fumes, you're going to be retarded, or your child's going to be born retarded. This is not nice stuff to work with. You need lots of ventilation. You need to be careful about touching it. which means slight exposure here and there is not going to harm you. So if you get a bit on your finger, wipe it off, it's not going to do any real damage. But if you start feeling lightheaded, dizzy, and you're working in an area with no ventilation, then you're probably going to end up a bit of a mess. And the studies saying long-term exposure can cause brain damage if you expose yourself too much. But the amount we're doing here, that's very unlikely, but it still is worth considering when you're picking up your tools to use. Think long-term of what you're going to do with them, because you don't want to damage your health through building toy robots. It's not a good investment to do. And that's one of the reasons I avoided this for quite a while. But I found a tube in a drawer and it was just the right thing for a project, so I whipped it out and started using it. But as I use it, I've got a window right next to me, completely wide open. I've got good ventilation. If I got too concerned, I'd even wear a ventilator mask with some good filters like you would for using resin dust or for airbrushing. And as I said, this is pretty good product. You'll find it in most hobby shops, and you can pick it up relatively cheap. It's one of the good things about it. It's cheap. You get a nice big tube, because this tube's not quite so big. So Squadron's a good option. Lots of people swear by it, especially old timers. This was one of the older putties, which is still around because it was a good product. So the next option I'm going to look at is Milliput. Now Milliput comes in multiple grades and therefore different things. There's a sort of a sculpting Milliput, a firmer Milliput, a softer Milliput. But for what we're doing, standard's basically what you want. Now standard's an epoxy putty, which means it comes in two parts, like this. You have a light part, which is what makes it soft, and you have this one is slightly old, but you can see the putty here, which makes it hard. This is it's the one slightly tacky, and together they have a chemical reaction. They have a chemical reaction which makes them dry solid after a couple of hours. I think you have sort of it says dry hard in 2 to 3 hours from a normal room temperature. So you've got sort of an hour and a half to work with it, an hour, sort of that area, which is enough time to fill in gaps. And if you're using this, you definitely need to use a tool. And what you do is you mix the two parts together, just roll them between your fingers, smush them up. Sort of if you're playing with Play-Doh, it's kind of the consistency you get. So you mix them up and you get a decent quality putty out of it. And Milliput is one of my go-to putties because it is just very solid in every sense of the word. You can use this for DIY projects because it's such a strong bond. When it dries, it forms kind of a porcelain kind of pottery sort of strength. And because of its density, it can be used to fill in gaps nicely. Whereas the other putties will struggle to fill in gaps because they are slightly liquidy. This is a more firm texture where you can then use that to fill in gaps for having to fill in the entire gap, just the top layer, which is something the other putties can't do. An example of that is here is on this Gundam ground type kit. This knee pad is originally completely solid, but with this, what I did was I putting Milliput into the base and then I flattened it down, then sanded it down, and this has a completely smooth, firm texture. There's no give whatsoever. It sands beautifully, it cuts beautifully. It's just a very, very good putty to work with in almost any cases. Its only real downside is that you have to mix it up every time you want to use some, which if you're just doing a fast, quick filling, then it's not something you really want to sit there doing for 5 minutes mixing the putty to make sure it's all fully mixed. But it's a very good choice, and I would recommend always having a pack around, because the cost of this is £2 to £3 a pack, and that's delivered online. So in person it's probably even cheaper from any DIY store. So having a pack of this around it's always useful to have some. You see here, we're just filling in parts like this. It can be used on panel line seam lines as well, and it can even be used for sculpting original detail, where you will build areas up and then sharpen them down and sculpt them into what you want them to be. So Milliput, highly recommended. The only issue you may have is over time it does start to dry out. You can actually see it here where the firmer side will start to turn a darker shade of green and become kind of brown. At this stage it's still perfectly fine, it's still usable, but as it dries out more, it starts to get little almost stone texture bits in it, and that means it's no longer usable. At that point, just throw it away, buy another pack, keep it in a drawer, pull out when you need it, and you've always got a decent putty to work with. One advantage this has over the other putties, which I haven't mentioned, is the quantity of this determines how soft it's going to be. So if you want a much firmer putty, you can use more of the darker element to the lighter element, and it will take longer to dry because the mix isn't the same, but you'll get a much a different texture when you're working with it. So if you want a more of a thicker, harder putty to work with, you add more of the dark stuff, and if you want a lighter, bit more tacky putty to work with, you add more of the light stuff. This means you have lots of options when sculpting and when filling gaps. You can modify it to be what you want it to be. This also does break down with water while it's wet. While you're sculpting with it, you can use water and you can smooth it off that way and get a really nice smooth texture on it. Or you can water it down even into a paste of sorts. And while the paste isn't very useful as a filling agent, it's quite useful as a sort of a texture add. If you've got a really smooth surface you want dirty, you can water down some milliput, brush it over, you'll get a sort of a craggy texture to it. Very good. This is also very good for using in basing work. There's lots of tutorials out there with milliput for how to make different textured grounds and broken walls and this kind of thing, because milliput breaks very nicely when you snap it, and you can use that to get sort of a concrete-ish texture to it, or a stonework broken texture. It's good for sort of pavements being broken up, where you can mix that milliput, put it between two pieces of tin foil, and then smush it around a bit, and you'll get a really nice smooth pavementy look to it, which you can snap up to make into broken rubble. And I've used that on many bases, and I really recommend that as a detailing technique on smaller miniatures you want to do basing detail on. So milliput itself, highly recommended. There are other options out there. Sort of green stuff is very common to see, and green stuff's issue is that it's not a filler putty, it's a sculpting putty. And while it does work a lot like milliput, the end result is that it's kind of rubbery, and it doesn't sand well and doesn't cut well. So once you've let the green stuff dry, that's it. It's done with for that point in time. You are stuck with whatever you've got there, with very minor adjustments here and there. And this is an issue because a lot of working we do, use this piece here as an example. You can see I want to fill in this gap there, which means rather than having to fill this completely smoothly at this point, I can overfill it slightly and then sand this back and cut this back to its completely smooth surface. And because of the way files work, I'll have a much easier time making this smooth, just running a file back and forth, than I will if I have to smooth it while it's still on there. And while I think green stuff's very good for sculpt and seen some amazing results from it, I just don't recommend it as a gap filler, because you can't work after it's dry. You have to work at that moment in time, which is very annoying. And it also suffers from the same issues of the plastic putty, where it can shrink slightly as it dries and doesn't hold weight very well. It doesn't support itself very well unless you've got sort of an armature under it. So if you've got say a paper clip and you build around like a sword around it like that, that'll work fine. But for just filling in large gaps, like the gap on the Aegis head here, that gap where you can see sort of the gap is not like sort of along there, you can see just a line there. Green stuff wouldn't fill this, it would start to cave in and sink inside that gap. Whereas a stronger putty like the Squadron putty or the milliput, this wasn't an issue. I could instantly fill it up and it's firm enough where it'll hold itself in place. So that's why green stuff's not a good option. There are other putties, such as, I will show these off here. This is Epoxy Sculpting, which is again another epoxy putty, which is two parts. You have the lighter part here and the darker part in here. And this stuff is absolutely fantastic for sculpting. It holds its shape well, and I've never had a putty as nice as this to sculpt with. I used this on the Godzilla build and it was bloody brilliant, I have to say. But you can't really work for afterwards. It doesn't sand well, it doesn't cut well, it kind of turns a bit chalky almost as you start to sand away at it. and that's not what you're looking for in these kind of putties. If you're going to use an epoxy, that stuff's 10 times the price as Milliput, and Milliput's doing exactly what you want. We're not working on really high complex models here. Most of the stuff Bandai put out, you have a very small gap between pieces which need filling, if they need filling at all in some cases. And that type of work, you're not looking at a high quality sculpting putty where you need to get new detail in. You're quite happy with Milliput, and then sanding it down and trim it down just like on that knee pad. That, when painted, you will not see there was any join there whatsoever. It completely blends into the plastic itself, and that's what we're looking for on these kind of kits. So that's my recommendations from Putty. I would recommend, if you're just starting out, get some Milliput. If you're just starting out but you've got modelling experience but you're looking kind of some new putties to try out, I would recommend